May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer. Amen. So when I was growing up, grace before family meals usually took one of two forms. Either my dad said a really long prayer, or he said a slightly less long prayer, and each one of us, my sister, brother, and I, would say a Bible verse. For a while, we had this kind of game going where we would try to beat each other to say the shortest verse in the Bible. You see, in the New King James Version and the King James Version that we grew up with, verse 35 of today's gospel, chapter 11, said, Jesus wept. So my dad said amen. It would be a race to see who could say Jesus wept first. Of course, my parents said we had to find another verse and made us do a different one. Jesus wept. Two short words that tell us so much in this gospel about how much Jesus cared for Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus. But this chapter is a whole long chapter with a lot going on the journey from with his disciples where he was staying to Bethany. This morning's gospel is a pivotal gospel that is the last of the 7 signs and then begins to transition to Jerusalem, to the last discourse, to the crucifixion, resurrection, and post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. This is the last sign that he performs in the Gospel of John. Up to now, he's turned water into wine, healed the royal official's son without going there, just speaking a word, healing the man at the pool, feeding the 5,000, walking on water, last week, as we heard, healing a man born blind, and then today, raising Lazarus from the dead. Each one of these signs revealed more and more the truth that John boldly declared at the beginning of the gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We also hear echoes of that opening to John's gospel when Jesus is talking to his disciples saying, "The light is here, and while the light is here, those who walk in the light do not stumble." So as we travel on this journey, on this road with Jesus and his disciples to Bethany, to the tomb of Lazarus, where are you in this story? We start off the story with Jesus and his disciples. He had gotten word that Lazarus was sick, and he just chilled out a little bit, and then it was time to go. He said to his disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." And the disciples said, "Do you remember when we were just there? It didn't go so great. They were trying to stone you." Is that where you are? Holding on to that place, that memory of when things didn't quite go so well. It's often the case that as Jesus' disciples, he will say, "Let us go," to a place that we tried that before and it didn't quite go so well. Perhaps not stoning, but we don't want to quite go there again. Or are you bold like Thomas called the twin, who after Jesus explained, "Listen, Lazarus is asleep. Okay, fine, he's dead. Let's go to him." Thomas the twin said, "Let us go also, that we may die with him." On your journey through this Lent, and as we approach our observance of Holy Week, are you like the other disciples, a little hesitant to get on the road? Or are you bold like Thomas, saying, "I will follow you, Lord, wherever it goes, even if it leads to death"? As we continue on the road and they begin to approach Bethany, not far from Jerusalem, we see Martha running out to meet Jesus on the road. When she gets to him, she says to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." But I believe that God still hears you, and I still believe that God hears what you ask. How many of us have been on that part of the road? Having earnestly prayed, having earnestly cried out to God, having, as the psalmist said, called out from the depths, waiting for God, like more than watchmen for the morning, more than watchmen for the morning. And then the unthinkable happened anyway. Lord, if you had been here, things would have gone differently. Lord, if you had been here, we wouldn't be where we are right now. Lord, if you had been here. That's a place that I think many of us have experienced in our lives. We are people of faith, knowing and trusting that God will show up when we call, and yet our voices constrict with the cries of, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now look." But Martha doesn't stop there. She continues to say that she does still believe that God shows up. And this allows her the opportunity to continue to engage with Jesus in an amazing way. She said, "Yes, I know he will rise again in the last day," which is already a statement of tremendous faith and belief in who Jesus is. But then Jesus takes it even further and says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this?" And Martha makes a declaration of Jesus' messiahship that is amazing and marvelous. She says, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God." See, in the other Gospels, it was Peter who made the first declaration of Jesus as Messiah. But here, it's Martha. And I think it's important to see that she made this declaration even in the midst of grief. Even with the cries of, "Lord, if you had been here," on her lips, she still said, "Yes, Lord, I declare and believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God." What kind of faith is that? Have you had that kind of faith in your life? Perhaps this is the kind of faith that has been forming in you during this Lent, of looking for signs that God is still showing up, even in the midst of grief and in the midst of, "Lord, if you had only intervened." How are you still able to say, "Yes, Lord, I believe"? Even when things haven't gone how you prayed for them to go, how are you still able to say, "Yes, Lord, I believe"? I think part of why Martha was able to do this was because of the relationship that she had with Jesus before this time started. See, we know that this wasn't the first time that Martha and Jesus had met each other, because it says that Martha and Mary and her brother Lazarus were friends with Jesus. They had a deep relationship with Jesus. When she sent the letter, they didn't say, "Oh, Jesus, look, you got another letter of somebody who's sick." They said, "No, Lazarus, whom you love, is sick." In order for Martha to be able to make this declaration of faith in the midst of her grief, she had previous experience with who Jesus was that allowed her to believe who Jesus is and will be. That kind of relationship is formed not in the midst of the fire, but before the trials and tribulations come. In order to be able to say, "Yes, Lord, we believe," we have to first take time to sit at the feet of Jesus, to hear his teaching, to learn from him, to get to know him on a friendship kind of basis. You see, later on when it says, "See how he loved him," it uses the word for friendship, the word that Philadelphia comes from. It's not the kind of agape love that we often associate. It's not the kind of agape love when it says, "For God so loved the world." This godly, all-encompassing love. This kind of love is a friendship, intimate kind of love. And in order to be able to say, "Yes, Lord," that's what we have to develop before we get to the trial. After Martha declares her faith, she goes and gets her sister and says, "He wants to talk to you too." And when Mary gets there, she says the same thing, "Lord, if you had been here." And this time when she hears these words and she sees the folks who came with her crying, Jesus was moved and began to cry. One commentator said that this was probably the most human that Jesus appears in all of the Gospels. That yes, in all of the Gospels, we are more and more learning about Jesus as the incarnate Son of God, Jesus as the Word made flesh. But here, in this moment, we see all the full glory of God vulnerable, crying with the community who's in pain. Jesus had already told his disciples that he was going to raise Lazarus, so he already knew what he was going to do. He knew that Lazarus' death at this time was temporary, and yet he cried with those who wept. How many times have you been guilty of when someone is in the midst of great pain and you can see to the other side and saying, "It'll be all right, don't worry, it'll be okay." And the fact is, it might really be okay, but in that moment, are you willing to let yourself be vulnerable and weep with them? Not in despair, not in giving up hope, but in friendship, in love, and community, the way that Jesus shows us here in this text. Jesus was greatly moved by their grief and wept with them, even as he was on his way to reveal God's glory in a magnificent way. And so Jesus continued on to the tomb with Mary, Martha, the community, and the crowd. And see, I make a distinction here between the community and the crowd. John's gospel says the crowd was with him, the crowd was with them. But I think there was community with them and there was crowd with them. There are some who were there, who were weeping with Mary, who followed her out of the house when she was crying because they thought she was going to the tomb, and they wanted to be there to support her in their grief. But I think there were some folks who were there who were just trying to see what was going to happen. I think that as they ran, they said, "What's happening? What's going on?" and joined in the procession. I think the community were the folks who were there crying. The community were the folks who said, "See how he loved him." But the crowd were those who said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of a blind man have kept this guy from dying?" And sometimes it's easy to switch between being part of the community and part of the crowd. Sometimes we start off as part of the community, wanting to show up and be supportive and show forth God's love, but we find ourselves sliding into cynicism, sliding into, we'll see, sliding into those places of, well, like the sister said, if he had been here, we wouldn't even be at this tomb. As we journey on our journey of faith, we need our community with us. We need those who will weep with us when we weep, who will celebrate with us when we celebrate. But we have to also realize that sometimes the crowd is going to join in too. We must then be willing to turn aside from the crowd and pay attention to the voice of those who speak the words of love, those who speak the words of compassion, those who speak the words of Jesus' presence. We also need the community to help us live into the new life that Jesus is promising us. After they rolled the stone away, after some warning, like, "It's been 4 days, are you sure you want to do this?" He said, "Roll the stone away." And he called him out, "Lazarus, come forth." When Lazarus came out, he was still a little bound up by the funeral garments, bound up by strips of cloth. And Jesus said to the community, "Unbind him and let him go." The reality is that when Jesus offers us new life, when Jesus brings new life to us, we have work to do as community to let that new life flourish. God does the work of new life. God does the work of resuscitation. God does the work of making possible that which is impossible. That's God's work. And we have a hand to help that new life thrive and flourish. We have a hand in moving away those barriers that would prevent folks from hearing, feeling, seeing God's love. We have a duty as community to take away any kind of barriers that would have someone stay in the place of death, destruction, and despair. Jesus said to the community, "Unbind him and let him go." As we journey on this road from where Jesus was to Bethany and then on to Jerusalem, this is a pivot point. This is chapter 11 of John's Gospel. There are 11 more chapters, and in those chapters, we have the procession into Jerusalem, Jesus' farewell discourse, the crucifixion, resurrection, and post-resurrection stories. This is a journey of pivoting. Where are you on this journey? We are beginning our pivot. Next Sunday, we will observe Palm Sunday, where we observe Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem and mark the beginning of Holy Week. As we come to that journey, where are you? Are you holding back saying, "I don't know about this. This is not quite how we've done it before. I don't know if I'm going to participate in this"? Are you willing to say, "Let's go. Whatever happens, happens. We're following you, Jesus"? Are you approaching the journey wanting to be fully engaged, but your heart is heavy with grief, wondering if God really is going to show up? Lord, if you had been here. Are you part of the community, helping to support those who are burdened and bogged down by the changes and chances of life? Where are you on this journey? Where could the Holy Week journey take you? Where might Jesus take you from where you are, more and more to the new and glorious life that we will celebrate at Easter? What might Holy Week have in store for you? I invite you, as we go into this last week of Lent and then begin Holy Week next week, to think about, to pray about, to be intentional about being honest about where you are, and praying for God to move you more fully into that Easter life we will celebrate. May our prayer be this week that among the swift and varied changes of the world, our hearts may be more and more prepared to be fixed where true joys are found with Jesus Christ. We have a bit of a journey ahead of us, but together we will travel it, knowing that in Jesus Christ, true life, true joy is to be found. Let us travel together, my friends.